The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Westfield Conservatory as 23-year-old Dante Richardson walked through the historic building's marble hallways. His sneakers squeaked slightly on the polished floor, and he couldn't help but notice how different he looked from most of the other students rushing past with their designer bags and perfectly pressed clothes. Dante wore his usual outfit, comfortable jeans, a simple black hoodie, and the headphones that rarely left his neck. He'd saved for 3 years to afford even one semester at this place, working 2 jobs while creating music in his tiny apartment late at night. This was his dream, though, getting formal training at one of the country's most respected music schools. He pushed open the heavy wooden door to Lecture Hall B and stepped inside. The room was beautiful, with tiered seating that curved around a grand piano in the center. About 30 students were already seated, most of them chatting in small groups. Dante noticed he was one of only 3 people of color in the entire room. He chose a seat toward the back, not wanting to draw attention to himself on the first day. As he settled in and pulled out his notebook, he heard whispers from a group of students a few rows down. They kept glancing back at him, and he caught fragments of their conversation. "Do you think he's in the right class? Maybe he's lost?" Dante pretended not to hear them. He'd dealt with this kind of thing before. Let them think what they want, he told himself. He was here to learn, not to make friends. The room fell silent as an older white man in his 60s entered, wearing an expensive-looking suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Dante's monthly rent. This was Professor Raymond Colton, a legend in classical music circles. He'd studied under famous composers in Europe and had been teaching at Westfield for over 30 years. Professor Colton set his briefcase down with a heavy thud and surveyed the class with sharp, calculating eyes. When his gaze landed on Dante, it lingered for a moment longer than comfortable. There was something in that look, a mixture of surprise and disapproval. "Welcome to Advanced Music Composition," the professor began, his voice carrying easily through the lecture hall. "This course is not for amateurs or hobbyists. If you think making beats on your laptop qualifies as composition, you're in the wrong place." A few students chuckled nervously. Dante felt the comment was directed at him, though the professor hadn't looked his way. "Real composition," Colton continued, walking slowly around the grand piano, "requires years of dedicated study. It requires understanding the masters, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms. It requires discipline, sacrifice, and above all, respect for centuries of musical tradition." For the next 20 minutes, Professor Colton outlined his expectations. The workload was intense. Weekly composition assignments, analysis papers, and a final project that would be performed by the conservatory's chamber ensemble. Several students looked worried, frantically taking notes. Then came the part Dante had been dreading. "Let's go around the room," Professor Colton announced. "Tell us your name, your musical background, and why you think you belong in this class." One by one, students introduced themselves. They talked about private lessons since age 5, summer programs at prestigious music camps, parents who were professional musicians. Each introduction seemed more impressive than the last. "I studied piano at the Royal Academy in London," one girl said proudly. "My composition was performed at Carnegie Hall when I was 16, a guy in a designer sweater announced. Dante's palms started to sweat. His story was nothing like theirs. He'd taught himself music theory from YouTube videos and library books. His first keyboard was a cheap one he'd bought at a thrift store for $20. Finally, it was his turn. "Dante Richardson," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm a composer. I write orchestral music mostly. I mix it with modern production techniques." Professor Colton's eyebrows rose. "And where did you study?" "I'm mostly self-taught, sir. But I've been composing seriously for about 8 years now." The professor's expression shifted from curiosity to something like pity, mixed with disdain. "Self-taught," he repeated slowly as if the words tasted bad. "I see." There was an uncomfortable silence in the room. "Well, Mr. Richardson," Professor Colton said, leaning against the piano, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I should warn you that this class operates at a very high level. We study serious music here, not the kind of thing you might hear on the radio or at a nightclub." Dante felt his face grow hot. "I understand that, Professor. That's why I'm here, to learn." "Indeed." The professor gave him a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see how you do." But I should tell you that many students who don't have proper foundational training find this course quite overwhelming. There's no shame in dropping down to an introductory level if you find yourself struggling. Several students turned to look at Dante, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed smugness. "I'll manage," Dante said quietly, holding the professor's gaze. Professor Colton shrugged and moved on to the next student without another word. For the rest of the class, Dante tried to focus on the lecture about sonata form and thematic development, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd already been judged and found wanting. The professor's words echoed in his mind. Proper foundational training. What did that even mean? Did it only count if you learned in expensive classrooms from prestigious teachers? Did the thousands of hours he'd spent studying scores, analyzing compositions, and creating his own music mean nothing just because he'd done it alone in his bedroom? When class finally ended, Dante gathered his things quickly, wanting to escape before anyone could make comments. But as he headed for the door, he heard Professor Colton's voice behind him. "Mr. Richardson, a word, please." Dante turned back. The other students filed out, a few lingering by the door to watch. Professor Colton stood by his desk, organizing papers. "I don't mean to discourage you," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I've been teaching for a very long time, and I can usually tell within the first day which students have what it takes." "And you don't think I do?" Dante asked directly. The professor looked up, meeting his eyes. "I think you have passion. But passion without proper training is just noise. The greatest composers in history all had masters to guide them. They studied the rules before they could break them. They paid their dues." Dante stood there, unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to defend himself, to prove this man wrong. But another part, a quieter part, wondered if maybe the professor was right. Maybe he didn't belong here after all. "I'll work hard," was all he said. Professor Colton nodded dismissively. "We'll see." Class dismissed. As Dante walked out of the lecture hall, he felt the weight of doubt settling on his shoulders. He'd faced skepticism before, but something about Professor Colton's words cut deeper. This was a man who represented everything Dante wanted to become. Respected, knowledgeable, successful in the classical music world. And that man had just told him, in not so many words, that he didn't measure up. Dante pulled his headphones over his ears and turned on one of his own compositions as he walked across campus. The familiar melodies gave him comfort. Whatever Professor Colton thought, Dante knew he could create beautiful music. He'd proven it to himself countless times. Now he just had to prove it to everyone else. 3 weeks had passed since that first uncomfortable day in Professor Colton's class, and things hadn't gotten any easier. If anything, they'd gotten worse. Dante showed up early to every lecture, completed every assignment with meticulous care, and participated in class discussions whenever he could. But no matter what he did, Professor Colton seemed determined to dismiss his contributions. When Dante raised his hand to answer a question about harmonic progression, the professor would call on someone else. When Dante submitted his analysis papers, they came back with harsh comments scrawled in red ink, even though other students with similar answers received praise. The other students had started to notice too. Some felt bad for him, occasionally giving him sympathetic looks. Others seemed to agree with the professor's assessment, whispering and snickering whenever Dante spoke up in class. But today was different. Today was presentation day. Each student had been assigned to compose a 3-minute original piece and present it to the class, explaining their creative choices and musical influences. Dante had poured his heart into this assignment. He'd written a piece that blended classical string arrangements with subtle electronic elements, creating something that felt both timeless and modern. He'd spent countless hours perfecting every note, every transition, every dynamic shift. This was his chance to show Professor Colton what he was really capable of. The morning of presentations, Dante arrived at the lecture hall with his laptop and a portable speaker system he'd borrowed from a friend. His hands trembled slightly as he set up his equipment, but he told himself it was just excitement, not nerves. The first few presentations went smoothly. Students played their compositions, explained their thought processes, and received feedback from Professor Colton. Some comments were constructive, others were glowing with praise. The professor seemed to be in a decent mood, nodding along to the music and offering detailed analysis of each piece. Maybe today would be okay, Dante thought. Maybe the professor would actually listen with an open mind. "Mr. Richardson," Professor Colton finally called out. "You're next." Dante stood up, gathering his notes and making his way to the front of the room. He could feel 30 pairs of eyes watching him. The lecture hall suddenly felt very small and very quiet. "Good morning," Dante began, his voice slightly shaky. "The piece I've composed is called Intersection. It explores the meeting point between classical orchestration and contemporary production, showing how these two worlds can complement each other." He pressed play on his laptop. The music began with a gentle string melody, soft and melancholic. Gradually, subtle electronic textures faded in underneath, adding depth and atmosphere without overwhelming the organic instruments. The piece built slowly, layers adding upon layers until it reached a powerful climax where both elements merged into something entirely new. Dante watched the professor's face as the music played. He was hoping to see some sign of appreciation, maybe even surprise. Instead, he saw something else entirely: irritation. Before the piece even reached its halfway point, Professor Colton raised his hand. "Stop, please stop the music." Dante's finger hovered over the keyboard, confused. "Sir, it's not finished. The resolution comes in the next section where—" "I said stop it." The professor's voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. Dante pressed pause. The sudden silence was deafening. Professor Colton stood up from his chair and walked toward the front of the room, his footsteps echoing. "Class, this is exactly what I warned you about at the beginning of the semester. This is what happens when someone tries to compose without understanding the fundamentals." Dante felt his stomach drop. "Professor, I can explain the theory behind—" "The theory?" Colton interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Richardson, playing some strings over electronic noise is not theory. It's not composition. It's barely even music," a few students gasped. Others looked down at their desks, clearly uncomfortable. "Let me play that back for the class," the professor continued, reaching for Dante's laptop. He restarted the piece, but this time, he made exaggerated facial expressions as it played. He winced dramatically at the electronic elements, shook his head at the chord progressions, and even held his hands over his ears at one point. Some students laughed nervously. Others just looked horrified. "Do you hear this?" Professor Colton asked the class, pointing at the speakers. "This is what passes for composition in today's world. No respect for tradition, no understanding of form, just throwing sounds together and hoping something sticks." Dante stood frozen, his face burning with humiliation. He wanted to defend himself, to explain the careful thought that went into every choice he'd made, but his throat felt tight and his mind had gone blank. "The string arrangement is derivative," the professor continued, warming to his subject. "You've essentially copied every generic film score from the past decade. And these electronic elements, they're completely out of place in a serious composition. This sounds like something you'd hear in a shopping mall, not a concert hall. With respect, sir," Dante finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, "many contemporary composers are exploring this kind of fusion. John Adams, Max Richter, Olafur Arnolds. Don't you dare compare yourself to established composers," Colton snapped, his face reddening. "Those men studied for years at the finest institutions in the world. They earned the right to experiment. You, Mr. Richardson, have not earned anything." The room was completely silent now. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Furthermore, the professor continued, pacing back and forth, "Your harmonic choices are simplistic at best. A first-year student could have written this. Actually, a first-year student probably could have written something better, because at least they would have been trying to learn proper technique instead of chasing whatever is trendy on the internet." Each word felt like a physical blow. Dante's hands were shaking now, and he clenched them into fists at his sides, trying to maintain some composure. "I don't understand why you're even in this class," Professor Colton said, stopping directly in front of Dante. "Advanced composition is for serious students with serious training. It's not for people who think they can learn everything from YouTube videos and call themselves composers." That last comment made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. It was too specific, too personal. Everyone could tell this had gone beyond constructive criticism. "Maybe you should consider a different path," the professor suggested, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost kind but was somehow worse. "There's no shame in admitting that classical composition isn't for you. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a contemporary music production program, or maybe even just keeping music as a hobby." Dante looked at his laptop, at his notes, at the piece he'd worked so hard on. He thought about all the nights he'd stayed up late, perfecting transitions and balancing levels. He thought about the joy he felt when he finally got that climax section exactly right. And now this man was telling him it was all worthless. "Can I at least play the rest of the piece?" Dante asked quietly. "The resolution addresses some of the concerns you—" "No," Professor Colton said flatly. "We've heard enough. I think you've taken up quite enough of the class's time. Please return to your seat so we can move on to students who actually prepared serious work." Dante gathered his equipment with trembling hands. The walk back to his seat felt like miles. He could feel everyone watching him, could sense their pity and discomfort. A girl in the third row gave him a sympathetic look, but that somehow made it worse. As he sat down, Professor Colton called the next student to present. Just like that, it was over. 15 minutes of systematic humiliation, and now they were supposed to move on as if nothing had happened. The next student, a guy named Christopher, who came from a family of professional musicians, played his piece. It was a perfectly adequate string quartet, technically proficient but not particularly innovative. Professor Colton praised it extensively, calling it mature and well-crafted, and exactly what I expect from students at this level. Dante barely heard it. He was staring at his laptop screen, at the waveform of his composition, wondering what he'd done wrong. Was the professor right? Was his music really just noise? Had he been fooling himself all these years, thinking he had talent when he actually had nothing? The rest of the class period blurred together. More presentations, more feedback, more praise for everyone else. When the lecture finally ended, Dante packed up his things as quickly as possible, desperate to get out of that room. But Professor Colton's voice stopped him at the door. "Mr. Richardson." Dante turned, hoping against hope for an apology, or at least some private acknowledgement that maybe the criticism had been too harsh. "I want you to know that I'm not trying to be cruel," the professor said, organizing papers at his desk. "I'm trying to save you from wasting years pursuing something you're not suited for. Sometimes the kindest thing a teacher can do is be honest about a student's limitations." Dante nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Use this as a learning experience," Professor Colton continued. "Not everyone is meant to be a composer. There's no shame in that." As Dante walked out of the building and into the bright afternoon sun, he felt numb. Students walked past him, laughing and talking, living their lives. The world kept turning, completely indifferent to the fact that his dream had just been shredded in front of 30 witnesses. He sat down on a bench outside the conservatory, staring at nothing in particular. His phone buzzed with a text from his mom, asking how his presentation went. He didn't know how to answer that. Sophie Chen couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in class that afternoon. She'd witnessed uncomfortable moments in Professor Colton's lectures before, but nothing like the absolute demolition of Dante Richardson. The whole thing had felt wrong, unnecessarily cruel. That evening, Sophie sat in her dorm room, supposedly working on her own composition assignment, but her mind kept drifting back to the presentation. Something about Dante's piece had stuck with her. Despite what Professor Colton had said, she'd actually liked it. The way the strings had interacted with those subtle electronic layers felt fresh and interesting. There was something else too. That melody in the opening section sounded familiar, like she'd heard it before somewhere. Sophie pulled up her laptop and opened a music streaming app. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for, but her fingers seemed to move on their own as she typed "orchestral electronic fusion" into the search bar. Several playlists popped up, featuring various contemporary composers. She scrolled through, half listening to different tracks while working on her assignment. Then about 20 minutes in, a song started playing that made her freeze. That exact melody from Dante's presentation. Sophie checked the track information. The artist name was D. Flo, and the song was called City Light Symphony. It had over 15 million plays. Her heart started racing. Could it be a coincidence? Maybe Dante had accidentally copied someone else's work. But as she listened closer, she realized it wasn't just the melody, the production style, the way the classical and electronic elements interacted, the specific chord progressions. It was all the same approach Dante had used in his presentation. This wasn't copying. This was the same composer. Sophie clicked on the artist profile and her jaw literally dropped. D-Flow had over 50 million total streams across all platforms. His top tracks had been featured in commercials, indie films, and viral videos. There were collaborations with respected classical musicians, remixes by electronic artists, and playlist placements on every major streaming service. She scrolled through the catalog, clicking on random tracks. Each one showcased the same sophisticated blending of orchestral composition and modern production that Professor Colton had dismissed as shopping mall music. Then Sophie noticed something in the artist bio. It mentioned that D-Flow was a self-taught composer from the Midwest, who'd gained recognition through social media platforms before landing professional opportunities. It also noted that despite having no formal training, the artist had been praised by established composers for innovative approaches to contemporary classical music. Sophie's hands were shaking now. She clicked over to a video platform and searched for D-Flow Composer. The results were overwhelming. Concert footage, behind-the-scenes studio sessions, interviews with music journalists. And in every single video there was Dante Richardson, wearing the same headphones he had around his neck in class, explaining his creative process with the same quiet intelligence he'd shown in his presentation. One video had over 3 million views. It showed Dante conducting a youth orchestra, performing one of his pieces at a summer music festival. The comment section was filled with praise. This is the future of classical music. Finally, someone making orchestral music that speaks to our generation. Showed this to my music teacher, and now she's incorporating D-Flow pieces into our curriculum. Sophie kept watching, clicking from video to video in a state of disbelief. There was Dante on a podcast talking about democratizing classical music. There was Dante accepting an award at an independent film festival for his soundtrack work. There was Dante in a studio session, showing how he layered real orchestral recordings with electronic elements. In one interview, Dante talked about facing skepticism in the classical music world. A lot of people think that because I didn't go to a conservatory or study under famous teachers, my music isn't legitimate, he said to the camera. But I believe music education should be accessible to everyone, not just people who can afford expensive schools. You don't need permission to be a composer. Sophie felt sick. While Professor Colton had been lecturing Dante about respecting tradition and earning the right to experiment, Dante had already been doing exactly that, and being recognized for it by thousands of people. She grabbed her phone and pulled up the class group chat. Most of the students were online, probably working on assignments. Sophie, guys, you need to see this right now. She sent a link to D-Flow's artist profile. For a moment, there was no response. Then the messages started flooding in. Tyler, wait, what? Ava, is this the same person? Sophie, yes, Dante is D-Flow. I just went down a whole rabbit hole and it's definitely him. Ava, oh my God, he has millions of plays. Tyler, this can't be real. Sophie sent more links. Videos, interviews, articles. Within minutes, the entire group chat had erupted into chaos. Students were sharing their discoveries, expressing shock and disbelief. Jessica, there's an article here calling him one of the most innovative young composers working today. Carlos, he won awards? Actual awards? I've actually heard his music before and didn't even realize it. That commercial with the city lights, that was his piece, Tyler. So Professor Colton just humiliated someone who's literally more successful than any of us will probably ever be. The chat went quiet for a moment as that reality sank in. Sophie, what do we do about this? Jessica, what can we do? It's not like we can force Colton to apologize, Ava. Maybe Dante doesn't want anyone to know. Maybe that's why he didn't say anything. Sophie thought about that. It was true that Dante had only introduced himself as a composer, without mentioning his online presence or success. Maybe he wanted to be treated like any other student, to learn without the baggage of his reputation. But then she remembered the look on Dante's face during that presentation, the humiliation and defeat. That wasn't right, regardless of Dante's reasons for staying anonymous. Carlos, we should at least tell him we know and that we support him. Tyler, agreed. What happened today was messed up. Over the next hour, more students joined the conversation. People who weren't even in Professor Colton's class heard about the situation and started sharing their own experiences with the professor's dismissive, attitude toward students from non-traditional backgrounds, Sophie found herself reading through D-Flow's comment sections, where fans from all over the world expressed how his music had affected them. Classical musicians praised his technical skill. Young people thanked him for making orchestral music feel relevant. Music teachers shared how they used his work to inspire their students, and Professor Colton had called it shopping mall music. The more Sophie learned, the angrier she became. This wasn't just about one bad critique. This was about a system that valued pedigree over talent, that dismissed innovation as gimmickry, that assumed someone's worth based on where they came from rather than what they could do. By midnight, the group chat had evolved into a plan. Several students wanted to confront Professor Colton, to show him the evidence of Dante's success and demand an apology. Others suggested going to the department head to file a formal complaint about the professor's treatment of students. Sophie, we need to be careful about this. We don't want to make things worse for Dante Ava. True, maybe we should talk to him first. But no one had Dante's phone number, and he wasn't in any of their social media circles. The guy kept to himself, arriving just before class started and leaving immediately after. Sophie realized they knew almost nothing about him personally. Tyler. Well, we have class again on Thursday. We can talk to him then, Jessica. Assuming he even comes back after today, that was a sobering thought. Would Dante return to a class where the professor had publicly demolished him? Would he drop the course or maybe even leave the conservatory entirely? Sophie clicked back to one of the videos, watching Dante talk about his approach to composition. He spoke with such passion and clarity, explaining complex musical concepts in ways that made sense even to people without formal training. This was someone who truly loved music, who understood it deeply, and Professor Colton had tried to break him. She thought about her own journey in music. Sophie had been fortunate enough to have parents who could afford private lessons and summer programs. She'd had every advantage, every opportunity. And yet she'd never created anything as original or impactful as what Dante had built on his own. The system wasn't just unfair, it was broken. Sophie made a decision. She wasn't going to wait until Thursday. She was going to find Dante tomorrow and talk to him. Let him know that at least some people in that class recognized his talent and were appalled by how he'd been treated. The next morning, Sophie got to campus early and stationed herself outside the music building, hoping to catch Dante. She waited for over an hour watching students flow in and out, but no sign of him. She tried again between classes. Still nothing. By lunchtime, Sophie was starting to worry. Maybe Dante had already dropped the course. Maybe they'd never get the chance to make things right. She was heading to the cafeteria when her phone buzzed. The group chat was active again. Ava. Just past Colton in the hallway. Heard him talking to another professor about yesterday's presentations. He called Dante's piece an embarrassment to the institution. Sophie's blood boiled. The professor wasn't just indifferent to the harm he'd caused, he was proud of it. Tyler. That's it. I'm going to the department head tomorrow. This has to stop. Several other students chimed in with agreement. What had started as concern for one classmate was turning into something bigger, a collective stand against a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. Sophie finally spotted Dante late that afternoon, walking across the quad with his headphones on. Lost in his own world, she jogged to catch up with him. Dante! Hey, wait up! He turned, surprised. When he recognized her from class, his expression became guarded. Hey, he said cautiously. Sophie caught her breath. Look, I know this might be weird, but I wanted to talk to you about yesterday. About what happened in class. Dante's jaw tightened. I really don't want to talk about it. No, I know, but Sophie pulled out her phone. I found your music. Your real music, D-Flow. Dante's eyes widened. For a moment he looked like he might run. Please don't be mad, Sophie continued quickly. I wasn't trying to dig into your life or anything. I just recognized the melody from your presentation and then I started searching and... She shook her head. Dante, your music is incredible. Millions of people know that. And what Professor Colton said yesterday was completely wrong. Dante stood very still, his expression unreadable. Thursday morning arrived with a tension that seemed to permeate the entire music building. Word had spread beyond just Professor Colton's class. Students from other departments had heard about what happened, had watched D-Flow's videos, and were talking in hushed voices in the hallways. Dante had spent the past 2 days seriously considering dropping the class, maybe even leaving Westfield altogether. His conversation with Sophie had been awkward but ultimately reassuring. She'd promised that she and other students wanted to support him, not exploit his online identity for drama. But support didn't change the fundamental problem. Professor Colton had made it clear that Dante didn't belong, and nothing was going to change that man's mind. Still, Dante found himself walking into Lecture Hall B that morning. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the years of pushing through adversity that made him unwilling to quit. Either way, he was there. The room fell silent when he entered. Every student turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of sympathy, admiration, and curiosity. Dante made his way to his usual seat in the back, hyper-aware of all the eyes following him. Sophie caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod. A few other students smiled at him. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. Professor Colton entered exactly on time, as always, carrying his leather briefcase and wearing another expensive suit. He seemed to be in good spirits, completely unaware of the shift that had occurred in his absence. "Good morning, class," he said pleasantly. "Today we're going to discuss orchestration techniques in romantic period compositions. Please turn to Chapter 7 in your textbooks." Students pulled out their books, but there was an unusual energy in the room. People kept glancing at each other as if waiting for something to happen. 10 minutes into the lecture, Sophie raised her hand. "Yes, Miss Chen?" Professor Colton acknowledged her. "Professor, I have a question, but it's not about the romantic period. It's actually about contemporary composition." The professor frowned slightly. "We'll cover contemporary music later in the semester. Right now we're focused on—" "Specifically," Sophie interrupted, her voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear, "I wanted to ask if you're familiar with the composer D. Flo?" Several students sat up straighter. Dante felt his stomach drop. What was Sophie doing? Professor Colton looked annoyed. "Miss Chen, as I said, we're not discussing contemporary music today. If you have questions about current composers, you can visit me during office hours." "I think it's relevant to our class," Sophie persisted. D. Flo is a composer who blends classical orchestration with modern production techniques. You know, like what Dante presented on Tuesday. The room got very quiet. Professor Colton's expression hardened. "Miss Chen, I don't appreciate you wasting class time on this. We've already discussed Mr. Richardson's presentation, and I made my assessment clear. Now, if we could please return to the actual curriculum. But did you know that D. Flo has over 50 million streams?" Sophie continued, pulling out her phone. "That his work has been performed by orchestras around the world? That he's won multiple awards for composition? Streaming numbers are not an indicator of artistic merit," Professor Colton said sharply. "Any competent producer can manipulate algorithms and—" "I'm not talking about pop music, Professor. I'm talking about legitimate classical composition." Sophie stood up, projecting her phone screen to show D. Flo's artist profile on the classroom display. Dante wanted to sink into his chair and disappear. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of, his two worlds colliding in the worst possible way. Other students started pulling out their phones, joining in. "There are articles in classical music journals about his work," Ava added, finding one on her screen. "The New York Classical Review called him a vital new voice in contemporary composition. The International Film Music Critics Association gave him an award last year," Tyler said, reading from another site. Professor Colton's face was reddening. "I don't care what some internet publication says. Anyone can start a blog and call it journalism. Real musical authority comes from institutions, from peer review, from the American Composers Forum?" Sophie interrupted, pulling up another page. "They featured him in their Emerging Artists series. Or what about the Lincoln Center? They commissioned a piece from him last year." The professor was speechless for a moment, staring at the information being presented. "And Professor," Sophie said, her voice taking on an edge, "there's something else you should know. D. Flo and Dante Richardson are the same person." The revelation hung in the air. Students who hadn't already known gasped. Professor Colton's eyes darted to Dante, who sat frozen in his seat. "That's—" the professor started, then stopped. His face went through several expressions: surprise, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like panic. "So when you told Dante his music was shopping mall music," Sophie continued, You were actually criticizing work that's been praised by some of the most respected voices in contemporary classical music. When you said he didn't understand theory, you were talking to someone whose compositions are studied in university music programs. Other students started speaking up, their voices overlapping. He's collaborated with the Berlin Youth Orchestra. His soundtrack work has been nominated for international awards. He's given talks at music education conferences. Professor Colton held up his hand, trying to regain control. Everyone, please. This is highly irregular. Mr. Richardson, if you had informed me of your professional work, I certainly would have. Would have what? Dante finally spoke, his voice quiet but cutting through the noise. Treated me differently? That's exactly the problem, isn't it? The room fell silent again. Dante stood up slowly, his heart pounding. I came to this class to learn, Professor Colton, not to show off or prove anything. I wanted to be treated like any other student. I wanted honest feedback on my work. And I gave you honest feedback, the professor said defensively. If your composition had merit, I would have said so regardless of your background. No, you wouldn't have, Dante said, surprised by the strength in his own voice. You decided I didn't belong the moment you saw me. Every comment, every dismissive look, every time you ignored my hand in class, that wasn't about my music. That was about who you assumed I was. Professor Colton opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. You know what's funny? Dante continued. I actually agreed with some of your criticism. That piece I presented wasn't my best work. I rushed it, tried to make it more academic to fit what I thought you wanted. But you didn't engage with what I actually created. You just saw what you expected to see. Mr. Richardson, I think you're being overly sensitive. Don't. Dante's voice was sharp now. Don't tell me I'm being sensitive. You humiliated me in front of the entire class. You told me I should quit, that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong here. And you did it with such confidence, such certainty, that part of me actually believed you. Sophie and several other students nodded in agreement. The thing is, Dante said, I don't need your validation. Millions of people connect with my music. I've worked with incredible musicians who respect what I do. I've made a living doing what I love. I came here because I wanted to grow, to learn from people with different perspectives. But you're not interested in teaching me. You just want to protect your idea of what real music should be. The door to the lecture hall opened and everyone turned. Dr. Helen Morrison, the department chair, walked in, followed by 2 other faculty members. Her expression was serious. Professor Colton, she said formally, I need to speak with you immediately. The professor looked flustered. Dr. Morrison, I'm in the middle of a class. Now, please. Her tone left no room for argument. As it turned out, several students had filed formal complaints about Professor Colton's conduct, not just regarding Dante, but about a pattern of dismissive and biased behavior toward students from non-traditional backgrounds. Tyler had gone to the administration the previous day, and his complaint had triggered an investigation that revealed similar issues going back years. Professor Colton gathered his briefcase with shaking hands. Class is dismissed, he said tersely, avoiding eye contact with everyone as he followed Dr. Morrison out of the room. The moment the door closed, the lecture hall erupted in conversation. Students gathered around Dante, some apologizing for not speaking up sooner, others expressing admiration for his work, many just wanting to show support. I can't believe that just happened, Dante said to Sophie, still processing everything. Believe it, she replied. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry it took so long for any of us to stand up for you. Later that afternoon, Dante received an email from Dr. Morrison asking to meet with him. When he arrived at her office, he found her genuinely apologetic and disturbed by what had transpired. Mr. Richardson, or should I say, D-Flow, she began with a slight smile. I've spent the last several hours reviewing your work, and I'm honestly stunned. Not just by the quality of your compositions, but by the fact that you've been a student here for weeks and no one in the department knew who you were. I wasn't trying to hide it exactly, Dante explained. I just wanted a normal learning experience. And instead you got Professor Colton, Dr. Morrison said with a sigh. I want you to know that his behavior is unacceptable and doesn't represent the values of this institution. We're conducting a full review of his conduct. She leaned forward, her expression serious. But beyond that, I want to make this right. We should have been celebrating your presence here, learning from you as much as teaching you. How would you feel about conducting a masterclass for composition students? Share your approach to blending classical and contemporary elements. Dante was surprised. You want me to teach a class? Why not? You've clearly developed techniques that work. Your music reaches people in ways that traditional classical composition sometimes struggles to do. That's valuable knowledge. As they talked, Dr. Morrison outlined several opportunities: the masterclass, a possible guest lecture series, even a collaborative project with the conservatory's chamber ensemble. She also offered him a full scholarship for the remainder of his time at Westfield. I appreciate all of this, Dante said carefully, but I need to think about whether I even want to stay. What happened in that class? It was more than just one professor being harsh. It showed me how people in this world see someone like me. Dr. Morrison nodded sadly. You're right, and I can't promise you won't face similar attitudes elsewhere in the classical music establishment, but I can promise that here at Westfield we're going to do better. That evening, Dante sat in his apartment, thinking about everything that had transpired. His phone kept buzzing with messages, from classmates, from followers who'd heard about the situation, even from other musicians offering support. One message stood out. It was from Sophie. Whatever you decide about Westfield, just know that today mattered. You standing up like that, speaking your truth, it changed things. For all of us, Dante smiled. Maybe change was possible after all. 3 months had passed since that confrontation in Professor Colton's classroom, and Westfield Conservatory felt like a completely different place to Dante Richardson. He'd decided to stay, but on his own terms. The scholarship helped tremendously, freeing him from the financial pressure that had been hanging over him. More importantly, he'd found his voice within the institution, no longer trying to shrink himself to fit someone else's expectations. The masterclass that Dr. Morrison had suggested turned into something much bigger than anyone anticipated. When the conservatory announced that D-Flow would be teaching a 6-week intensive on contemporary composition techniques, students from across the entire music program signed up. They had to move it to the largest lecture hall just to accommodate everyone. That first session, Dante walked into a room packed with over 100 students, many of them sitting on the floor or standing along the walls. He'd been nervous, worried that people would see him as an outsider trying to play teacher. But the moment he started talking about music, about the creative process, about finding your own voice, something clicked. The biggest lie in music education, Dante told the class that first day, is that there's only one right way to do things. Yes, learn the rules, study the masters, understand theory, but then remember that every single one of those masters we study broke the rules of their time. Bach, Beethoven, Stravinsky. They were all considered radical and controversial when they were creating their most important work. He showed them his process, breaking down how he constructed pieces from initial ideas to finished compositions. He demonstrated how classical orchestration principles could coexist with modern production techniques, how understanding harmony made electronic music more sophisticated, how traditional instruments could be recorded and manipulated to create entirely new textures. The students were fascinated. They asked questions, shared their own experiments, and challenged some of his approaches in ways that made Dante think deeper about his own methods. This wasn't just him teaching them. It was a genuine exchange of ideas. Sophie had become something of a friend, one of the few people in the conservatory who treated Dante like a regular person, rather than some kind of celebrity. They'd started grabbing coffee between classes, talking about music and life and everything else. You know what the best part is? Sophie said one afternoon as they walked across campus. People are actually questioning things now, like why we spend so much time studying dead composers and barely any time on living ones. Why the curriculum is so focused on European classical tradition and ignores other musical traditions. Your class opened up these conversations, it was true. Dante had noticed a shift in the atmosphere at Westfield. Students were experimenting more, taking risks in their compositions, blending influences that would have been dismissed as inappropriate just a few months earlier. But not everyone was happy about these changes. There were still faculty members who viewed Dante's presence with skepticism, who believed that internet success didn't equal genuine artistry. Some older students felt that the traditional standards were being lowered to accommodate trendy music. And there were whispers that the conservatory was sacrificing its prestigious reputation by embracing popular culture. Dante tried not to let it bother him, but some days it was harder than others. Professor Colton, meanwhile, had been placed on administrative leave while the investigation into his conduct continued. More students had come forward with their own stories of dismissive treatment and biased assessment. It turned out that Dante's experience wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern that had been going on for years. The investigation revealed that several talented students had dropped out of Westfield specifically because of Professor Colton's teaching methods. Students of color, students from working-class backgrounds, students who'd come to classical music through non-traditional paths. They'd all felt unwelcome in his classroom. Eventually, Professor Colton resigned before the formal proceedings concluded. He issued a brief statement claiming he was retiring to pursue other opportunities. But everyone knew what had really happened. Dante didn't feel victorious about it. If anything, he felt sad that it had come to this. He'd never wanted to destroy anyone's career. He'd just wanted to be treated with basic respect. The real victory came in smaller, more meaningful ways. A 14-year-old kid from Detroit sent Dante an email saying that seeing someone who looked like him succeed in classical music made him believe he could do it too. He'd started taking free composition courses online and was writing his own pieces now. A music teacher from an underfunded public school reached out, asking if Dante would be willing to do a virtual workshop with her students. She said most of them had never imagined that classical music could be for people like them. A conductor in Seattle decided to program one of Dante's pieces for her community orchestra, specifically choosing it to attract younger and more diverse audiences who might not otherwise attend classical concerts. These stories accumulated, each one reminding Dante why he made music in the first place. It wasn't about proving himself to institutions or winning over critics. It was about connection, about creating something beautiful that spoke to people's experiences. The conservatory's chamber ensemble invited Dante to compose a new piece for their spring concert. He spent weeks working on it, creating something that honored classical traditions while incorporating elements of his electronic production style. The piece, titled Intersections, explored the meeting points between different musical worlds, classical and contemporary, acoustic and electronic, tradition and innovation. The night of the premiere, the concert hall was packed. Students filled the seats, but so did members of the local community who'd heard about D-Flow performing at Westfield. Some faculty members looked uncomfortable with the crowd. It was younger and more diverse than their typical audience, with people wearing everything from formal attire to streetwear. Dante stood backstage, listening to the musicians warm up, feeling the familiar nervous excitement before a performance. Sophie found him there, grinning. "There are people lined up outside who couldn't get tickets," she said. "Security is going crazy." "That's insane," Dante said, shaking his head. "That's the power of what you've built," Sophie corrected him. "You made classical music accessible to people who thought it wasn't for them." When Dante walked out to conduct the piece, the applause was thunderous. He looked out at the audience and saw faces that reflected the full diversity of the world. Not just the privileged few who traditionally had access to these spaces. The performance itself was magical. The musicians had embraced the piece, understanding the balance he was trying to strike between different musical traditions. When the final notes faded and silence hung in the air for just a moment, Dante felt a sense of completion. This was what he'd been working toward, not fame or validation, but the ability to create something that truly moved people. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes. After the concert, Dr. Morrison approached Dante with an unexpected proposal. "We want to create a new program here at Westfield," she said. "Contemporary composition and production, a track that legitimizes the kind of work you're doing, that recognizes there are multiple valid paths in music. And we want you to help design it."